Thank you for coming. It's a huge pleasure. I'm going to introduce these guys very briefly in a second. You can just Google them. Super famous. Now, what we try to do in the Institute, which is actually a department, it's a full-blown, I'm going to sit because that's the whole point, right? Is we try to bring these notions of public value, which we'll be talking about today, and public purpose at the center of how we think about the economy. The economy is actually an outcome. It's not like economic forces are forcing us to do stupid things. The economy is an outcome of how we actually govern all the different value-creating institutions, whether it's in civil society, trade unions, they produce value, whether it's in government, different types of public institutions, whether it's a publicly funded museum or the NHS, and the business sector, of course. But unfortunately, we only have a theory, a narrative, and framing of value for business. So one of the things we've tried to do in the Institute is to think about, on the public side, how can we get out of this really boring, lame, literally sleeping narrative of how we talk about value creation. So the state, for example, through public policy, economic policy, is at best seen, I feel like you have 4 people in the back, as fixing market failures. So facilitating, enabling, de-risking, patching things up when there's not a lot of investment. So if we actually want a co-creation and a co-shaping of the economy by really thinking through the governance structures of the public sector and the private sector and the third sector, what does that mean? What does it look like? And how can we actually make it with an accountability framework? So it's not just, as Greta Thunberg says, blah, blah, blah. And it's good I just mentioned Greta Thunberg, who's now 18, but when she was 16, she was already ranting about this, which is we don't have much time, right, for one of the biggest problems we have in the world right now, which is climate change. But there's lots of other problems around the digital divide. During lockdown, lots of kids globally didn't have access to their human right to education. There's all sorts of issues around health and so on. So the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were basically signed up to by every single country in 2015. In this series, of which this is this the last one? Good, it's the last one, is how do we walk the talk of a goal-oriented economy? How do we walk the talk of the Sustainable Development Goals? There's 17 of them, there's 169 targets beneath them, but in no way, under any sort of metric, are we achieving them. And we're going to be focusing on a particular area, which is actually a massive area, but we'll pretend it's particular, which is culture and the arts. And we are incredibly lucky to have this like super stellar crowd. And I think I can call you all my buddies. And I met them in all kind of random ways. And in each case, I was like, come to the Institute. So with George, we met in a pub. How long was that? 4 years ago? Through our common friend, Tanya Moti, who actually is someone who's looking or has been trying to defend and analyze issues around diversity, tolerance, disabilities in the BBC. And she brought us together at the pub. And I said, George, you're too smart, come and do a PhD with us. Anyway, he's a Peabody Award-winning spoken word artist. Francis Morris, who is now at the Tate as a director, but has been at the Tate in different forms since 1986, is that right? 1987, sorry, my first mistake. So we met actually through, I think, our late friend Akim Steiner, who is a curator, who got us talking about the public value of art, how to actually measure it, because the Tate Modern, who I'm sure you've all been a million times, is incredibly successful, notwithstanding the fact that art is measured in such a lame, siloed way. And I think we have someone from DCMS tonight who will be convinced, yay, that we need to do things differently. So if you're only measured by how many ticket sales you have, then you'll end up only doing blockbuster shows, right? Whereas the Tate's so successful because it brings people into the museum for the first time who've never been there, and showcasing artists, of course, who in the elitist way that we think about art often don't showcase their art. And Alvaro, I don't know what to say about him except that he's the coolest person I've ever been on a panel with. And luckily there was lots of photographers who's like, look, he's so smart, he's so cool, he wanted to talk to me. Because he, first of all, he exhibits everywhere, super renowned artist. And the exhibit he had at the South London Gallery, which is directed by our common friend, Margot Heller. Are you here yet? You definitely signed up. There you are, Margot. So she brought us together. And we just had such a cool conversation about sort of literally everything under the sun. So we're going to be more focused tonight. We definitely had more wine before our talk at the South London Gallery. We've limited it here. But it was very much actually around issues also around the New Deal, the fact that now there's all this talk about recovery plans globally, but how do you direct a recovery? How do we bring the arts to it so we reimagine what's even possible, right? And that requires poetry, the arts, and so on to rethink what are we even going for. So anyway, I really actually don't want to moderate this because I think the coolest thing will be if these guys just talk. I'm going to try to keep them, how do you say, contained. So I don't know, maybe we can start with George on why you actually are doing a PhD here. In terms of public purpose driven agenda, why would a spoken word artist even think about doing a PhD in a place that thinks about public value and public purpose?
Thanks for the generous intro. I guess going back to our initial conversation, which, as you said, was just a beautiful synergy of ideas. What first brought me to the artistic space was rap music when I was a teenager. I was rapping, and that was fun. There was a craft to it, and there was a social function to it. At a time where public funds were disappearing in our environment, the fact of rapping gave us an excuse to talk to each other, to meet each other, to link up in different estates, which sometimes might be problematic because of the economic condition that we found ourselves in. Rap brought us together. But what I found is that in the text, in the substance of a lot of what we said, some of us were speaking about this earlier today, our thinking, our orientation, our aspiration was heavily shaped by commercial incentives. So how you make your music depends on, what your path, what your strategy to going commercial is. What we used to call going commercial, becoming a commercially viable artist. When I was growing up in the mid-2000s, that wasn't a given. No one had really, from our community, no one had really cracked it. No one had an airtight strategy from the street environment to commercial viability. So what we used to do is talk a lot about making money, put out signals through our music about our ability to make money, i.e. Talking about themes and topics and subject matter within our lyrics that would appeal to people, not necessarily leading a conversation about, how to change our environment. But that was always my conviction. How can we, through this art, create a discursive space that will allow us to move to the next step, break us out of these economic, what's the word when you're in a pit? What's that? Just like rut. Pit? We're in a rut. Yeah. So I really thought about music as a space to start experimenting with that stuff. And I went to university, found an audience that wasn't the same as the audience I grew up rapping around, and decided to switch to poetry. And I used poetry in order to open up that discursive space. I wanted more space to analyze. I wanted more space to reflect. And because of the skill set that rap music had gifted me with from an early age, I was able to engage a lot of people, a lot more people than I did as a rapper, and a lot more people than I would have purely as an academic. So poetry became my hybrid space, and I was able to go out and take that space or apply that craft to different media. That was cool. As the years passed, I adapted that into a podcast series, which allowed me to do long form stuff. So I'm basically releasing rhyming essays about our society, about our culture, about our direction, which was my dream when I was a kid. But I was still bothered by the gap, the gulf between what I'm doing in terms of creating that discursive space and the audience that's gathering around it, and the increasing commercialization of the culture that gave me this skill set. So I'm bothered by that gap, and I'm constantly thinking, what would it take to protect this culture? What would it take to expand the understanding of this culture beyond purely commercial value? And that's how we had our beautiful conversation. Mariana was like, oh my God, I've been thinking about this for like my whole life, and what you're talking about, might find some value in the framework that we've developed over here. And that's how I came to do a PhD at IIPP.
Promise to get to you guys in a minute, but just to kind of go deeper into what you were talking about, one of the things that keeps coming up in our conversations is this idea of like the narratives of who's kind of included, who's excluded, who has confidence and self-worth in terms of even talking about themselves as a value creator versus those who are excluded. So the whole rap business has actually different types of the arts community. It's kind of like a lottery, a winner-takes-all model. So we talked about in our initial conversations also what are kind of alternative business models that might get inspiration from the mutualism, and cooperative culture, and how do you actually not only admit that value is created collectively, but how do you distribute it and socialize the rewards? And if you want to just say something about that, because then I'm going to move to Francis and go further into this issue of commerce and the market.
Well, through my work with you and through my conversations with a lot of you guys,
I forced him to talk to all of you. Right?
We've had great conversations. I understand how rap music and a lot of black culture in general is a perfect microcosm of some of these narrative injustices. How we talk about where the value is created, how the value is created, but where that value gets siphoned off. Yeah. In rap music, you see a trickling up, right, of the value that is created on the ground being heavily concentrated in very tightly owned media companies. The practices, the norms, the contract conventions are inherently exploitative. The whole setup of a lot of these industries is one of exploitation, one of extraction. So I've always thought to myself, look, it's not just rap. This is part of a much bigger story about the constant creativity of this young black demographic, from the blues to jazz to ska to reggae to currently we have African music, Afrofusion, Afro beats. There is a constant musical innovation that tends to outperform its beginnings. It tends to have appeal beyond its beyond the group that created it, and it has a lot of commercial viability. So that is almost like a sure thing. So it's a bet that will not lose. Why is it doesn't correlate to a growth in wealth from the same demographic, from the same regions that produce this innovation? And ultimately, it goes down to the business model. Yeah. And for years, I've just imagined what it would be like. It started with a trip. I took my nephews to Disney World, and I thought to myself, if all of this could be elaborated from one person who demonstrably had ideas that had mass appeal, then imagine a community that has all of these ideas. Imagine if the commercial viability of whatever they create is linked to a safety net, to social provisions, to the regeneration, to the infrastructure that is going to allow these guys to live their lives in peace and have true self-determination, which, as a matter of course, is usually denied from the same communities that produce this valuable, world-changing music.
Great. Thank you so much. Every time I and George's supervisor, Karen Edge, supervise him, we just end up like that. And that's not a good thing, because supervisors are supposed to be nasty. Like, come on, where's that work? Come on. Anyway, like he's supervising us. Anyway, so Francis, again, we met when we started thinking, or I sort of wanted to engage with you because, first of all, the Tate is obviously a museum which, you know, we all, I think, admire so much, but don't recognize the struggles behind it. Because in some ways, as I mentioned before, it's almost like you succeed notwithstanding the screwed up method that we actually value art. So if you can talk a bit about what we've talked about in terms of the blockbuster model, that is the one that's being fed to you, and how you have somehow escaped it, but also how it's kind of destroying your soul, so you have to drink wine at conferences.
Well, I suppose one of the things that we first talked about actually was climate emergency.
Oh, yeah.
And so my interest in thinking about the economic framework of value was to try and find a way of challenging the business model that sits behind cultural institutions like Tate, and in particular to think in a more complicated way about the different registers of value that underpin the institution. When I first joined the Tate, as you say, a long time ago, there were sort of two registers of value. One was around the kind of belief in the intrinsic value of art. And I got to the Tate at a time when the Tate still believed in a canonical art history based on a kind of canon, art by white, European and white men. And that felt a little bit odd as a young feminist. So that was one register of value, that there was a kind of, this was the most important art. And the other register of value was the importance of the public institution, of the civic space. And both those things really underpinned the birth of the museum in the 18th century. But what happened under Thatcher and subsequently in the kind of neoliberal era was that as government withdrew their funding, when I started at Tate, we had 100% funding from the government. So incremental withdrawal of government funding, the institution, and I not mean not just Tate, but institutions had to find a way of instrumentalizing their activity to produce income. So there's three registers of value now at play, which are complex and they all rub up against each other. And we're trying to decolonize the canon at the same time as we're trying to please a corporate sector that's very traditional and work with philanthropists who still invest in the canon. So you've got this kind of clash of cultures. And at the same time, all three of those bounce up against the marketplace, which, the marketplace, as we know, anybody who's here in relation to art, is absolutely rampant, hungry, voracious, but also serves a very small proportion of the visual arts community. It's the top end. And so the kind of community that George is talking about exists outside that marketplace. So for an institution like Tate, and probably South London Art Gallery as well, you're playing this, you're kind of dancing between these really very different scenarios where the pie chart of funding is like that for the upper echelon. A lot of attention goes into the Warhols of this world, and a tiny bit goes into the poets of this world, but it's that part of the ecosystem that is the future and that we value and that we absolutely need to rebalance going forward.
So, follow up. In sociology, which I don't know anything about, but had to learn a bit about when I was starting to think about value, they have this funky concept called performativity, which is how you actually judge and evaluate the performance of something, literally, do you like it or not, then feeds back into what actually happens.
Yep.
And that feeds back into how you value the narratives, the framings, and so on. So given this kind of dysfunctional model, where, for example, philanthropy somehow, definitely even in my world of health and energy, is almost running the show. Like, philanthropy should be the icing on the cake. When it becomes the cake, we got a problem. How does this model where you have philanthropists who, with one hand, as Anand Giridharadas in his book Winner Takes All talks about, do kind of bad, say in the hedge fund world, and then make money, put it into a foundation, and then fund the Tate, or fund the British Museum, our common friend who I won't name, does that. Like, what is that model doing to this marketplace? Because the market doesn't really mean anything. There's different types of markets. So that's to you, and then I'm going to ask two questions to but it's back to you.
Well, I think philanthropy and the marketplace are hand in glove. It's as simple as that.
But in theory, that's not the case. In theory, you have the market.
But in practice, it is the case.
Exactly.
Yeah, because that's where reward, recognition, profile, celebrity sits between these two things. And that's
so what does that mean?
Well, philanthropists, what they want, name association, they not want profile, and that's where they get it.
Right. And what is the philanthropy model of art versus a business? I mean, forget the public sector and the public value. There's business and there's philanthropy. They're not the same thing.
I think philanthropy these days is so transactional.
Right.
There's very little give and not count the cost. And that's from corporate sponsorship, from people want to be associated with brand. Simple as that. That's why Tate does very well compared to a number of amazing organisations across the UK that have no philanthropic support. Right. We get it because we are Tate.
Okay. So Alvaro, when I saw your exhibit, and I must say I haven't had the luck yet to see your many other exhibits, and I think in London you actually have more than one gallery, and I was going to ask you about that because that itself is almost a business model, a way to diffuse and decentralize almost the ownership of one place over your art. But if you can talk a bit about both that wonderful exhibit, because I was struck also by how this issue of climate and the climate emergency in some ways was across it, and we also talked quite a bit about that. But also, why is it today, and I'm sorry if I'm picking on you on this, and you don't have to answer this question, you can actually say anything you want, but like artists used to not be embarrassed about talking about politics, right? I mean, even the Bauhaus movement and so on is very linked actually to big kind of discussions and debates, and some artists are kind of like completely on the side, and it seems like you and what you were searching for in our discussion, at least that's what I got from it, the South London Gallery, was an explicit, not an implicit discussion of politics, the economy, and art. So that's not even a question, just say whatever you want. That's what happens when we drink wine. Open questions.
I told Francis and I were talking earlier, and we were like, usually on these panel conversations, people like tend to do like talking points, but I'm gonna try to just kind of, because that's the only way I know how.
Yeah.
I mean, my art really is a simple thing of me trying to figure life out, and I think if I'm curious about something, I make something to try to figure it out. Like I don't. There's some people who like write thesis papers, and then at the end they go, "Oh, this is what I think now of it."
Right.
Like my paintings are really just me, selfishly like being curious about something, and then going, "Okay, like how do I figure this out?" The South London show that we met at, that Marco invited me to do, was really just like me trying to figure out like how does climate change like what are some of the conditions in which climate change is sort of occurring. And you kind of hear it all the time, and so I just thought, okay, well, I'm not very smart, let me try to listen to a bunch of people. And my folks is from the Caribbean, and I live in New York and now here, but I'm really conscious of like how things are kind of playing out in like these different spaces. And so the exhibition was just like thinking about a place like Grenada or Jamaica and a place like New York, and how these sort of these both of these places are going to be affected by climate change, but how does it really kind of affect the condition of these places and the nature of these places, and so that was kind of the exhibition. But there was a few things that were sort of being brought up that I thought was really interesting, and I think both between like what Francis and George were saying, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is, and this is a little bit of regurgitation because I've said it so many times, but culture is a story we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? And so if you tell yourself, I'm American, that means how that controls how you think how loud your voice you think it should be, who you should hate, who you should have sympathy for. If you tell yourself you're British, that also, and these are oftentimes, to me, where the real narratives are sort of happening. I think when I think about like institutions, there's been a lot of carried stories about white men that they have internalized and sort of created great, sometimes really incredible art, and said, this is my story, and I want the world to know it. Institutions, universities, like I always think you go to university to learn how to love white men. You don't go to universities to learn how to love any other people. And what a lot of times people are talking about is like, how do you go to a university to learn how to love everybody? Right? How do you get an education to love Asians, whoever, you know what I mean? And I think, I don't know where it's going. Maybe I had too many words.
But that's super interesting. Well, no. So there's a whole thing about decolonizing the curriculum, but even that is led by white people, actually. I mean, so I think what I found so amazing about your exhibit is that the narrative of even what we mean by climate change, you had those two different walls, no? And one was the Caribbean, and one was kind of, Europe and the Western world, and how we even frame what climate change is. Yeah. So George and I are in this Camden Renewal Commission. And one of the things we've tried to do is to bring people who actually live, for example, in housing estates to the table to frame a clean growth mission from the resident associations, from the civic assemblies, versus like high and above, we tell everyone to retrofit their homes, that's the clean growth agenda, and act, right? So that kind of co-creation bit, like who defines the story, who even says what is the Green Deal, seems to me very powerful. Actually, what you're all saying, which is who defines the objective, who defines the story, who feels their voice is even at the table, who's excluded. So yeah, I'm not going to ask any questions. Just say something.
No,
Every time I
but
stop, just say
this,
something.
this is all reminding me, especially what Alvaro just said about the function of universities and reproducing the stories we tell about our society. I was talking to a group of head teachers just earlier today, actually, and our conversation drifted into the gaps in public consciousness that are allowed by mainstream education. And I use the example, shouts out to Kehinde Andrews, in his book, The New Age of Empire. He highlights how in Tony Blair's autobiography, he presided over the handover of Hong Kong as Prime Minister. And he didn't know what it was all about, you know, and he kind of has a joke about this in his autobiography with no irony, no shame. He just, as Prime Minister, didn't even know. Another example I gave to these guys was a famous rapper in this country called Krept. He's a British Jamaican. He's of Jamaican descent. He did a DNA test. Turns out he's 70% Nigerian. And I mentioned this in passing to a friend of mine, a white man. He's a very good friend, a very intelligent guy. I've got a lot of respect for him. But he didn't understand why that was a thing. He didn't know that African people of African descent, are not indigenous to the Caribbean. As a white man in his mid-30s, an intelligent guy, he wasn't aware that black people are only in, or predominantly in the Caribbean as a result of British slavery. So there are these big gaps in the narrative that are allowed by our political culture, that are perpetuated by our educational culture, and art is the place where we get to fill those gaps.
Yep.
That's why it's important work.
Interesting.
And you know, I think that one of the important things around climate change for me is that it is at the intersection of those other emergencies around race and gender, and we have to understand it as a coming together of a kind of narrative that begins in colonialism and patriarchy. And institutions can tell those stories in a very powerful way. But the challenge for a public institution like Tate is that the funding structure and the institutional framework through government funding and the other checks and balances around funding pushes against that. So how do we move the institution to a place where it can co-create with its audiences the stories that they want to be part of telling, and do that in a way that is also allows the institution to thrive?
But this confusion of kind of price with value, to the point that I actually opened up one of my books with this, where after the financial crisis, which was basically caused by large investment banks and how they modeled risk and so on, you had the head of Goldman Sachs, what was his name? Blankstein, saying that Goldman Sachs workers were the most productive in the world, even after they got a $10 billion bailout by the US government. He was actually right. Like, they are the most productive if you actually, again, confuse price with value. They are the most paid, so they must be the most valuable. So this performativity point I brought in before, which is if you value and if you confuse price with value, and that then feeds back into what you value, of course you'll end up cutting schools, of course you'll end up cutting, in terms of the famous austerity, they didn't cut everything, they cut some things. Look at what's just happened with the Ukraine war. Overnight, Germany created 100 billion euros for the Ukraine war and simply changed the book so it doesn't go into the deficit, right? So it just doesn't even show up in terms of their debt to GDP. That's what we do when we go to war. No one has ever said, oh, sorry, can't go to Vietnam, can't go fight World War II, can't go to Afghanistan, can't go to Ukraine because there's no tax revenue. They create money to go to war. So this whole thing about austerity is itself a myth. We create money for war, we create money for COVID. All these COVID recovery funds in the US, $4 trillion, well, they still haven't unlocked it, but anyway, between 2 and 4, was because of a massive emergency, millions of people dying. So if we can move now, before we open up, to the solutions, which is what does it look like to give an equal importance, almost urgency, it's urgency to the arts and culture and the things that you write about and talk about, George, actually all three of you do. In normal times, whether it's public education and the arts, whether it's thinking about culture and the arts and reframing, but also being funded in order to allow these possibilities at the Tate, very much at the center of how you, at least, Francis, think about the Tate. What does that look like in terms of your relationship? Maybe we'll begin with you, Francis, and then we'll broaden out with the Treasury. or in terms of where the money comes from, because we know it's been cut, we know austerity is bad, blah, 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 but what's the solution? Like if you could.
Yeah, okay, so I think
terms
part
of
of the solution is
valuation.
to be bold enough and brave enough to switch the dial ourselves, which means to begin to shift resources from what we call the blockbuster model into other areas of value creation. So little investment is made by museums in public-facing, participatory family programs, for
Margot
example.
does.
Well, I'm sure she
Anyway.
does, but I'm sure even so, the cost of exit, we have to be bold enough to say, let's take a punt here. And if we can shift the dial, then that begins to send a very big message to our funders. One example of that, for example, is with a Uniqlo small sponsorship scheme, this families program, Uniqlo Take Play, that we've had for the last 2 years, which is
Uniqlo the shop.
Uniqlo the shop, but with a relatively small amount of money, but really amazingly imaginative investment. We have driven huge family audiences, the most diverse audience, the most local audience that we've ever had. And it's demonstrated that you don't need a huge amount of cash to, I mean, it's the kind of volume that might ship a couple of masterpieces to a blockbuster exhibition from Tokyo. If you use those resources differently, you can make a very, very major impact. So that's beginning to give people within the institution the confidence to think, actually, we can do things differently. But in the longer term, thinking about sustainability, it just does feel that something's profoundly wrong about a public sector that is massively underfunded and massively underprivileged and a very buoyant marketplace. And when the public sector absolutely feeds into that marketplace, and I can give you any number of names of artists who are now massively famous, Louise Bourgeois, Yayoi Kusama, whose ascent to the upper echelons of the marketplace has been supported absolutely by exhibitions at places like Tate Modern, made with government funds. And it just feels that there should be some kind of, what do you call it, feedback loop? Some kind of return on that kind of investment. That we are actually an ecosystem and that we need to find a way of actually working with a little bit more generosity on their part with the private sector, with the commercial sector.
Cornelia Parker, who's on our board and has been since we were founded 5 years ago, and did this. This is a small version of what's upstairs, which says "Hurry Up, It's Time," which we commissioned as a little institute for COP26, which was like, "Hurry up, it's time." You know, the saying at the end of when the pub's about to close, like, "Do your order." But this was referring to the IPCC report, which said there's 8 years left until climate change is irreversible. She often says, and she of course has a wonderful retrospective now at the Tate Britain, she would have never become an artist without the public fund. She was a working class woman, girl at the time from the north, and just would have never made it to today, showcasing at the Tate.
So those
with
funds,
today's funding, would have never become.
They have never been more squeezed. And what's interesting is that artist practice is more and more divided between artists who make tangible stuff for the marketplace and artists who work intangibly with live art, with performance, with lens-based media, with participation, with community. There's almost no funding for that kind of work, and that work is the future. You guys come in and then I'm going to open it up. You know, like when we first met also, you talk to people like Stuart Brand and Silicon Valley and these other models, the 1,000, what was it called? The 1,000 something?
1,000 True Fans.
Yeah. I mean, just these other models, like, because it seems like we're all very good at, saying the current system is crap, and yes, philanthropy, a lot of it is oligarch money or hedge fund money or private equity money, and then it comes in and to save the day and funds what the state isn't funding, and that itself creates its own dysfunction. But you were super curious about these new business models, and you can either, again, answer that or something else.
So a big interest of mine at the time was moving away from the big waves in the marketplace, in the biggest, most what's the word? The most influential elements of our market. And there's the 1,000 True Fans model, which has been updated by the originator of it, 100 True Fans. The idea that an artist only really needs a small but dedicated and consistent following to be able to sustain a career. And with a lot of our technology nowadays, platforms such as Patreon, YouTube is has always been a leader in providing creators with a lot of these opportunities that they can then expand from the first point of contact. With these opportunities, there is scope for artists to retain some sort of autonomy and not be pushed around by big, or not be compelled by big market forces. That's very powerful. As long as there is that opportunity to connect, to plug into the the online space and utilize some of these platforms, that's powerful. I'm very connected to the African context, so I always, I don't want to. I assume that we have an audience worldwide, and I don't want to imply that everyone's ability to speak their mind and to deliver their art to the world is equal. I was listening to you guys talk about visual art, and it breaks my heart because I know amazing artists in Kampala, Uganda, who they just don't have the exposure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not that the talent isn't there. It's not that the interest isn't there. It's just the connection to this global thing that will propel them. That's a real that grates on me. But looking at models of sustenance that don't require them to just sell to the highest bidder, I think that's a very important element when we look at the art space moving forward.
Alvaro.
There's so much to say. I really think that it's on our generation to try to reimagine new modes of conversation. New modes of what kind of social contract we live under. I think there's a generation of folks from the baby boomers who's designed a system that has worked really, really well for them. And in what probably very complicated times, I have no idea what it means to live under the Cold War or any of those things, but they've designed a structure such as deciding that your home is an asset and no longer a right, or college is a privilege and no longer a right. And I think there is a generation that's coming up right now that I see every day that is just actively looking at the structure and reimagining what happens. I think one of the things that, and this is something I've also said a lot of times, I think people over 25, 38, I was talking to some friends and I always think about this, there's a bit of a conservatism in my generation for a lot of well-to-do middle class folks, and that your first time you got allowed to vote in America was probably 2000, and then you saw the election being stolen, and then you saw the Iraq War, and then you saw George Bush, and then you saw the housing crash in 2008, and you saw Obama come in and become president, save the market, but not the house owners. You saw Trump becoming president after his grab him by the pussy remark. You saw all sorts of Brexit. You saw all sorts of things that made you feel that things could be taken away relatively quickly, and that it's better to be a bit more conservative, vote like Joe Biden or something like that. But I also think when I listen to 16-year-olds or 18-year-olds or whatever, they were just born in a generation where things move so fast. Things change for them in such a quick. They saw Me Too, trans lives, Black lives, Trump, Obama. They just saw so many changes happen so quickly that their imagination of what's possible is really, really much more wider. So I'm really excited to see what social contract they come up with. But I don't think it's going to come from the 30-year-olds operating today.
But something the three of you just said in your last points is almost like this disillusionment, right? That, you have it, as you just said, there's the arts world and the arts market, but many are completely excluded. The artists you were talking about in Uganda, but also the whole digitalization and globalization, all the people that don't feel like they benefited from that is one of the forces that have led to all this polarization and the Trumpism, right? I mean, he's taken advantage of it, but many people who voted for Trump have been screwed over by the system. And in Italy, the 5-star movement, again, it's this anarchist movement which kind of, tries to say, oh, all politicians are corrupt, it all sucks, we need kind of just to go against the system. Sometimes these rebellions against the system by those who genuinely have been excluded actually allow that system to be as strong as ever, because by not taking part of it, by saying it's all crap, all the politicians are equally corrupt, which of course is not true. We've worked with Georgia Gould, a politician in Canada. She is so the opposite of corrupt. One of my best friends, Chianwada, who's the MP for Newcastle Central, she's gone into politics, MP, for genuine public value, public purpose reasons. So that kind of tainting the business world as all crap, government as all problematic and so on, actually allows the system to not change. And that's why before I kind of ask this question, which I often ask my architect friends, and we have Leslie Loco here, who is amazing, and she's going to be she is the director of the 2023 Venice Biennale for Architecture. And when I ask my architecture friends, why aren't your voices in The Guardian? When economists don't like what's happening, we write articles. And it's sometimes they're also in the system. If you're living by commission, and if architects are living on a commission, if artists are trying to get funding, is there something, and sorry, this is probably a really ignorant question, but is there something maybe less in your world, but maybe a bit more in your world, that keeps, and definitely in your world in architecture, keeps people not silent, but a bit not wanting to fribble with feathers, whatever the expression is, because of where the funding's coming from? And what does it take to say, this is actually really wrong? Not only do we need a chat like this, but actually to really disrupt the system to get normal people to even understand what's happening in the arts. Because in this weird way, normal people, meaning not economists, understand the economy better than I think some citizens understand what's happening in the art world, because the arts are not out there talking about the kind of things we're talking about here.
Well, actually, I would challenge that, because I think the art world is talking about that a huge amount.
But to others? Or just to themselves?
No, I think, to themselves and to others. I mean, we're here tonight. But I do think that, cultural institutions, however radical, are only ever going to be a reflection of the bigger system in which they operate. So, so my challenge to you would be, how do we, since we are part of the system and or an ecosystem, we're challenging it in our own ways, but how can we radically intervene in the bigger part of the system without destroying ourselves and therefore, preventing ourselves from support all the, all the other ecosystems that we support. We're part of a network of, we're supported, but we in turn support communities and audiences, and we're absolutely, we're a rock, if you like, and so it's high risk to self-destruct.
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer I'd give, and I'm going to open up to the audience, is you need to come to the center of the system. So currently the arts are at the periphery. So the industrial strategy or the innovation strategy, we've talked about this. There's, the school teachers aren't at the center of that. The artists are definitely not at the center of that. There's STEM subjects and the sciences, and then economists like myself blabbing away about something or other. But the arts are on the side, and that wasn't the case in the Rooseveltian New Deal. And I don't know if it was tokenistic or not, and I'm not an expert, but the fact that actually the Works Project Administration had the arts at the center in some ways, as opposed to just this little project that you fund on the side, which is what happens today, where you might have an industrial strategy based on life sciences and, quantum computing and AI, and then of course we need culture, and there's a high multiplier effect, but it's there. Well, there's something about
culture hasn't been very articulate and convincing about demonstrating why it's important. Right. So it comes down to how do we articulate that value.
I have to say, I do think there's another element of this, because I understand the context that you're speaking to, but the context that I'm coming from is one of constants. It requires that you speak openly about exactly what you're talking about, where you stand, how your situation affects everything else, and what is needed to champion justice. That's a feature of Black street culture, for example, of rap culture, of grime culture. You speak very clearly and very openly, but in the context, the point that you made earlier, just about 2 minutes ago, in the context of our racialized, capitalist experience, the producers of that commentary, they're marginalized.
Yeah.
They are on the peripheries.
Yeah, they're not institutionalized.
Right.
But as soon as you do enter the institution, then there's another set of pressures that impose themselves. You kind of, you're kind of freer outside. You're maybe less privileged, but you are free.
Let's open it up. Should we do one and one?
Yeah.
A live and an online. Okay. Live. Lesson.
Lily, you go first.
I know my chickens. Patricia, who's also doing a PhD here.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. I think this has just been fascinating listening to everyone today, and especially public value of art. And I want to just put a very controversial question as an elephant in the room to start off with, and that's to do with African arts, stolen African arts. Whose value is that? Who does it belong to? And when we talk about public value, I've heard about the social contract, I've heard about what Francis talked about, how the conversation has always been about white male. It's all well and good, and we're having different pockets of translation of what art means to us. George has talked about how the Black street poet and rap music, etc. But regarding that and extractive acts that took place, whose value is that, and how do we restore that value to the right owners? And that question is to Francis, and also Alvaro, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are regarding this as well.
Well, I don't really have a problem with saying that, restitution matters. And that's hugely important.
How do we go about actualizing that? I mean, I think a lot of people have talked about restitution matter. And George, we had a conversation about this when we met as well. But in terms of actualizing that, how does it happen? How do you practicalize that? What happens?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because extraction is of works of art from Africa or whatever by artists, or the actual objects are part of a much bigger history of extraction. And so maybe the payback is not just the restitution of objects, but the support for development of cultural institutions and a kind of levelling up. I don't know what that looks like, but there needs to be more than just a return. Yeah. What does return look like? Is it just send the objects back, or is it actually to deal with some of the many years of continuing extraction, that legacy? I mean, what do you think? What would you like to see happen?
No, I'm curious. This is my time to ask questions.
But you guys comment, because I know you've also written about this recently.
I would say that a consistent theme about everything that we've spoken about is the need for us to use culture, us creators, institution owners and directors, etc., use culture as a space to fight our case. This is not always a space of agreement. This is not always a space of justice. So we need to recognize the opportunity to advance the case for justice. A lot of the restrictions that I feel in conversations like this are that, as I just spoke to, I often represent a demographic, or I identify with a demographic that is just the last to be considered in anything. So when we talk about government money, government spending, we ain't getting that, So that's the reason I became a poet. And I know that that's what you do as well. I know that that's what you do with your visual art. As you just described, in the case of Jamaica, in the case of Grenada, those people don't get a say on the global stage. So you map out the story, and you advance the case for justice. So I think it's very important for us to also be conscious that culture is made by us in the same way that the economy is made. It's not just something that we experience. It's not something that happens to us or lands on us.
I think to what both of y'all are talking about, which I think is really important for me, is like whenever I see the conversation around a returning of a stolen object to Africa, I always feel like it just, for me, is like conversations around virtue signaling, and that there are deeper issues that really will affect people's tangible lived life, and that, you know, by that those conversations are more interesting to me to be had. But I feel like one of the weird things that ends up coming out of educated folks is like of a certain generation, and this is what I mean by, like, I don't know, I think there's just like a lot of, we've accepted a lot of virtue signaling as progress, and we're not really asking about systemic changes in terms of how we affect people's lives. I mean, one of the things we have in the studio as part of my practice, you know, when my mama immigrated from the Caribbean, it was very hard for the community to get any kind of loans to get a house. So she started a really common tradition of starting a susu, where she collected a lot of folks' money and then gave them a large sum. And we have that in the studio as a practice, where a big chunk of my arts earning is set aside for community engagement, in which we actually talk to the folks and say, well, how do we deal with these in real ways? So, like, we can't control global warming, but in the Caribbean, we can think about how do we come to someone at a time that they've lost a home and say, well, how do we rebuild a home, right? And so we've been talking to a lot of architects in the studio in terms of a lot of these homes you could build homes because of technology today with like $5,000, right? And so this year we have an incredible architect, Samaya Valley, who's going to do some stuff for Notting Hill Carnival. And then the next step of it is designing homes that can be built within relatively quick means, but incredible homes that deal with, like, that provide things that are incredible. And to me, that addresses, like, why my mama immigrated in the first place. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, okay, you have a home that's loved, that's thought about. I think we have to start thinking more expansively and really kind of address baseline issues. How do you have a home? How do you have health care? Like, we have to start once again with, like, a baseline condition of, like, how do we imagine the dignity of folks and what their lives are worth, and, like, how, versus, like, really kind of virtue signaling things that just...
And would you put the virtue, sorry if I'm jumping in, but the restitution issue, would you put within that in terms of the virtue signaling, even though we don't want to just label stuff, but just in terms of how you've been thinking about it, the thing about the statues, like in Bristol, being thrown down versus this more systemic change, or can't they go together, like that one is a different part of that systemic change? Like, what's wrong with restitution and the systemic change? It's not just a symbolic, right? It could be metaphoric for a system.
I mean, I think I'm not against, like, tearing down the statues or whatever, but those are used oftentimes as, like, the conversation.
Right.
And so I think...
Monopolized.
Yeah, it becomes monopolized, and I think if we want change, then we really have to stop. You know, I just think I just don't want to give 1,000% of the volume to somebody who's screaming about tearing down a statue because it offends them on their walk to get a $5 cappuccino. You know, just is like, okay, I get it. But where we grew up, I mean, the amount of people I knew who grew up, and in my neighborhood who grew up, really, you know, there's real things that people need, and I'm not saying, like, I don't want to dismiss anybody who feels offended because they see something there, but I just think, like, come on, there's like, and I mean, this is something I've said this 1,000 times, but I grew up really, really, really poor in a working class neighborhood. And one of the struggles that I kind of constantly find myself in is that I know today more folks who'll be morally outraged if Donald Trump misgenders someone than if they walk past like a single mom with 2 kids and begging for money. Like, they will walk past that person and they'll be like, "Look what Donald Trump did," and I really, like, there's just something in me that I don't know. It's a weird thing that I struggle with, because I'm wondering what are you go to college to learn how to be upset about this thing and not about the other thing.
Yeah.
That's why we need the art, man, because it's a multifaceted, you know, it's a multifaceted movement when you're trying to advance a conversation. So ideally, the tearing down of the statue is the beginning point of a conversation that we have to.
Yeah.
Mariana puts it very well in terms of all of the work that IIPP do. It's war.
I think what's happening in the art world, and I say this a lot, it's like it's fulfilled by, like, there was a period in America where people moved to the suburbs because they didn't want to deal with what was happening in the urban areas. And I think what's happening in college, and I understand it, you come here, you have a kind of social mobility, and it's easier to, like, erase the thing that upsets you from your presence. Like, the idea of, like, removing a name from a museum, to me, is ultimate virtue signaling, because those things are, the folks that name that you erase is still participating in like giving people drugs or whatever, and then it just becomes like, well, I don't get to think about the person who's ODing over there because I walk in this place and I don't think about this thing anymore, and it just, to me, that's what I mean about the virtue signaling, as opposed to, like, well, let's talk about what does it mean that. And let's deal with this uncomfortable truth every day that we walk in and we have to think about a class of folks who's overdosing, right? It's become, no, let's remove that. They could continue to do what they're doing. There's more deaths last year than overdosing, but let's just remove the Sackler name and feel good about ourselves.
But isn't that, so I think the word you used before, and then we should go to Nye, because Nye's reading. And Nye, feel free to ask your own question. You don't just have to get the ones online, but she's going to moderate the online questions. But your point, the word you used before, more than the virtue, is the monopoly of the conversation. Whose voice is at the table talking about the statues, talking about the restitution? And that's the problem. It's not the restitution or the statues, it's who's framed it, and why has it become this little silo and a feel-goody thing, and then you can ignore the rest. Well, whereas I think what George is saying is, by opening up the voices at the table to even talk about the statues and making it this much wider conversation that then is the beginning of something, what you call systemic, that is different from just a bunch of, feel-gooders saying, Sacklers, get your name off. But should we go to, yes, sorry, Leslie.
That's the thing that art is fundamentally so good at, and it might be to do with the nature of it as a discipline, but it deals with complexity, it deals with ambiguity, it deals with challenges and opportunities kind of in the same breath. I remember when I first went to teach architecture in the US, it was the first time I'd ever heard the word problem. So students would come to me and they'd say, what's the problem for the semester? I thought, well, architecture, yes, it does solve problems at some level, but it's more than a problem. There's not a linear relationship between a situation and then the answer that solves that situation. And I think that's where art is, for me, magical, because it values the ambiguity. It encourages it actually as part of the way it discourses. And I think you mentioned earlier, this obsession with science and rigor, as if ambiguity is not rigorous.
And you often talk about porousness.
And the absolute porousness of art disciplines that allow influences from the outside in, but the kind of professional, more scientific disciplines are all about the rejection of porosity, the rejection of otherness. But I think that that's the very nature of art, which should be actually infusing so many other disciplines, because it accommodates confusion.
I also think that, you know, there is the virtue signalling, I think that's wrong, because I think what the current moment is creating a very potent and potentially powerful context of doubt. And therefore the conversations around restitution, around tearing down the statues, are beginning to have, all the Sacklers are beginning to have a very profound impact on the way institutions think about their ethical frameworks, about their autonomy, about their responsibilities. And I think that it's not overnight, but it will have very profound outcomes. So that restitution will not, in the end, just be about objects. It will be about brokering new relationships between communities that were extracted from, and a bigger sense of return and responsibility. And I could see that happening right across the visual arts sector now.
Do you want to bring in some online questions? And also Nai's research in her PhD is all about identity and how the digital platforms are actually making that whole issue problematic. But feel free to bring in your own, because I feel like there's such a relationship there.
Thanks to our panelists. So one of the first questions I'll bring in is from Maria Adebowale Short from the Foundation for the Future of London. And this is for all of the panelists. So how can we better integrate place and place-making into the public value of art conversation, particularly in the context of social value regeneration? And so that's the first one to begin.
I didn't read that.
Thank you for asking. It's like, who's that manager that, what?
I'm really slow, so when people use big words, I'm like,
So here's how I'm...
Yeah, say it in your words.
I think in terms of when talking about public value and some of the tensions that have been brought up within institutions and some of the constraints around that, and in terms of what's happening outside of institutions. So what's happening in people's communities. What can be done to maybe bring these things closer together, not so that it becomes captured by institutions, but how can they work together more effectively around maybe creating new types of ideas around the public value of art.
Yeah, I would say bring back public spaces and let the people decide what to do with them. When I was young, one of the things that really got me, set me on my artistic journey was a summer program called Brent Summer University. It was an initiative that was created by a prominent member of our community, and it used our youth centres and it used our schools during the summer holidays to just put on workshops for us to do fun stuff. And it's not reinventing the wheel, but it was available to us at no cost, and it kept us occupied for the whole summer. So that's just one, I think we devalue or we forget under the conditions of austerity, we forget what a difference this makes to real people's lives.
Maybe I can cite an example. 4 years ago, we worked with Tania Bruguera, the Cuban activist artist, on the Turbine Hall Commission, and right from the start, she was very keen to work with a group of local people, neighbours. So we were, we already have, strong networks in the local community, but 30 or so local people, the neighbours, signed up to be paid collaborators with Tania, and they were given a total license to challenge the organisation in any way that they liked. And at a first meeting with me, and they requested a meeting with me to talk about all sorts of things like our ethics policy, and the first request is they wanted to have one of them join the trustees. And I was able to explain why we couldn't do that because trustees were government appointed, blah, blah, blah. And the second thing they asked was they'd like to take Len Blavatnik's name off the Blavatnik building. And so I explained why we couldn't do that, but I'm thinking on my feet, I said, so, but we have got a building you can name. And so out of that conversation, the neighbours conducted an audit, a vote amongst the community, and we named the original Tate building, the Natalie Bell building, after a local community worker who was voted as the sort of significant figure in the neighbourhood. And overnight, it created this beautiful kind of polarity between the values of the neighbourhood and the values of philanthropy and the kind of traditional naming of buildings. And that has been a very kind of powerful symbol of being that placemaking and being embodied in a neighbourhood is a really powerful and important thing for the institution. And I completely agree with what you're saying, because so many people, myself included, had their light bulb moment in museums that you could just walk into on a Saturday morning or on a summer holiday. And it is my absolute pledge to make, over the next few years, at Tate Modern, a place where there is an always-on welcome for young people and families.
But can I come back to the point we raised before about putting culture and art at the center? Because I think we're so used to austerity that even just like funding youth centers, funding community centers seems like a radical idea.
Exactly.
So we need to not only fund them, but put them at the center. And I was always struck, George, once you told me the story when you were doing one of your podcasts where you had access to the BBC archive and you, from like 100 years ago or something, and found the voice of your uncle or grandfather or someone, and you had access to what I would call today the data commons, right? So where does the BBC archive, not iPlayer, which is like the last 5 years of shows, but the archive, the data commons, where does it sit? Putting that in public libraries, putting stuff like that in youth centers and community centers, and making them the center of what I call the entrepreneurial state and the innovation system, versus the innovation system like startups, venture capital, and then, let's help these poor little kids in their youth center, give them some money, right? Putting culture and the arts at the center of a public value, public purpose, innovation-driven system. That's the revolution. And I thought it was so interesting when you talked about that. Also, the BBC Orchestra, which you use in your podcast. I mean, who has access to that?
Exactly.
But in the absence of that, it's really imperative that museums and art galleries become youth centres.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is, you have to work with the toolkit you've got. And the only, in a situation, in a city like London, where privatisation of public space is rampant, it's incredibly important that the public spaces that remain take on a bigger responsibility for doing those things that libraries and youth clubs used to do.
Yeah.
Those points.
We have a question in the back. And should we take two at a time?
Yeah,
Is that
sure.
okay? So stop answering questions right away. Okay.
It's a really fascinating discussion. But Mariana, you just suggested, what can we do to put culture at the centre of things? I think we need a much more persuasive set of arguments as to why culture or art is the place in which to have these sort of conversations. So, for example, George, you said something like, art should be the place where we fill those gaps, right? Tony Blair's gap, the white friend's gap, you can about forced transportation of Africa. And you said things like, art is the place where we fight our case. One could say to that, shouldn't it be politics, or shouldn't it be education, or is it about economic disparity? To your point, Alvaro. I think we need a case like coming from the person there. What is it about ambiguity? What is it about porosity? What is it about the special thing that art does that makes it the place where we fight our case, or where we fill the gaps? And so my question to you would be, maybe to build on what Vanessa said before, how do you understand what's different to art between art and activism, or different between art and politics, or different between art and economics or education policy that makes it the place where we can have those complicated conversations?
Yeah, and if everyone asking a question could just say their name and maybe what they do.
Oh, sorry,
That's okay.
Tony Blair at UCL.
Okay. I think there's.
Hi, and I'm a part-time student here and sustainability consultant. Kind of building on that, and actually there's a really interesting tension in the question. So I think I'm really interested in art, the beauty of art for art's sake, and art as a way to drive the political agenda. And if you think we have less than 8 years now to achieve the SDGs, we're monumentally behind. We have to prioritise somehow, particularly because the arts are so underfunded. So given that, do we need to get to, is there space for artists to get really strategic about the way in which they use their resources to educate people on certain issues? So we need to, for example, have a widespread increase in uptake of plant-based diets and use of electric vehicles. Is getting very strategic and very political about the things that need to happen in our society something which artists could and should be thinking about? Or is that, do you think, as artists yourselves, do you think that's kind of overstepping the mark of what art is actually really all about? Kind of tapping into your question.
I try to do both of the things that you suggest. To the gentleman's point, when I was at that crossroads, I was a rapper. The rap thing wasn't really going anywhere, but the poetry provided me an opportunity to expand my critical space, to literally elaborate my argument about what this culture could do for us and how we take control of it. People responded way more than they ever did when I was a rapper rapping about rapping. So my ambition in that space was to invite the generation after me to use the arts specifically for that purpose. Speak overtly about what your case is. Speak to your environment. This is why I was speaking to a group of head teachers this morning, because there is it relates so much to the educational space. On my educational journey, there were two elements. There was the formal syllabus, and I tried my best at that. But what really gave me the opportunity to connect with people was taking some of the skills that I learned in formal education, but really cross-pollinating them with what I learned in our rap culture about speaking your truth and making your argument clear. So sorry, we didn't hear your name. Anna. To Anna's point, the reason I came and did this PhD with IIPP is that you can't necessarily freestyle your case. You can't just intuit it. The reason you are clear, for example, about the transition to plant-based diets and electric vehicles is you've had some time to think about it. I'm coming from a demographic where thinking time is scarce, thinking space is scarce. So I understand that there is a process of conscientization where we have to consciously commit to assessing our environment and responding to that environment and putting forward ideas on improving that environment through our art, which is why I have found it better than at that stage of my life, formal education, better than politics. I found poetry, the artistic space, the best way to demonstrate to the generation after me how you can make your case with a combination of rigorous inquiry that doesn't always lead to non-ambiguous answers.
But also your focus of your thesis is also very much on education.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that, again, the co-supervisor is from the Institute of Education, this sort of dichotomy which you posit in your question, I think is precisely what you're trying to kind of battle against. But
Right.
Did you guys want to say something? Should we go to another question?
I think one of the things Francis brought up was that arts can create doubt. When I was talking about virtue signal, and I really think you're right in that one of the roles that art can do is sort of posit ideas in a kind of digestible way to someone. Mm-hmm. You know, like I always say there's a direct correlation between people like DMX rapping about what being 13 and locked up means to today's conversation around prison reform. Mm-hmm. And like if you ever listen to like, you know, Ghostface Killer, like the first one of his songs is you hear wheels on a bus and then there's a kid talking to another kid, and there's like, how old are you, blood? And the kid's like 13. It's like 13, damn. The feds is running out of niggas to arrest. And I think today with people thinking about, well, what does it mean in terms of mental health for a 13-year-old to be locked in a box? I think there's definitely a direct correlation in terms of how that's put out. If you're just screaming outside that prison is, this punishment culture is a fucked up system, then maybe that's not really gonna go down. And I think to the question that both of you bringing up is like, and maybe even in the art world, and I think this is sort of the world that I'm sort of quote unquote the art world, the world that I'm sitting in, is that there was a period, to your question, like with Cornelia, is that there was a period where people expected artists to come out of larger cultural conversation, and today what you have now is galleries almost essential, like following this sort of neoliberal model where the only thing that makes you an artist is if you get like a Slade or a Yale degree. Mm-hmm. And I think that only reflects like a very particular percentage of a person's lived truth. And while we need to pull from these places, there's no more space for artists to be picked up from like the person who's making incredible art in like the most poppin' corner in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And I think what needs to happen is a sort of expansion of these spaces in terms of who's like where we actually think of where art is being formed. And it's probably forming on TikTok right now. There's like, I was just talking to this artist Patia, who runs Patia Fantasy World, and like, I mean, but anyway, sorry.
That's it. Let's get more from DCMS, right?
I'm Harman Zaga. I'm the head of economics for arts, heritage and tourism at DCMS, and running.
And DCMS for people who aren't in this country.
Department of Culture, Media and Sports. Yeah. So we obviously have a specific program that is looking to actually do much of this in terms of the Cultural Heritage Capital Program. But this is probably my question, because I've got many answers, but I'll give you my question, is one of the biggest obstacles, and I think someone said at the back, and I think it's come up a few times, it's one of the issues in the arts sector, is there isn't a consistent way of talking about outcomes.
Right.
There are so many different models out there, and no one comes together and says, well, these are the outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve. I've seen so many studies that go this way or that way. And so I think that's the question is, there is a reason for that, I'm not going to talk about it why that's now, but how do we get the sector to unify around that one way of talking about its value? Often what we find, as you know, economists in the sector, art humanities, heritage scientists, don't always work together. So how do we create that consensus of going forward? Because as you know, people have been part of cultural value debates over many years, we often just end in a debate without a solution. So how do we get to being on the same page? And that, I think, is where this sector's missing. We've done it for the environment sector. This didn't exist 30 years ago. Now the stuff we do on measurement in the environment sector is fundamental to how environmental policy is being done. And so that's my question, how do we get to a consensus?
Or could we just agree that there are certain things around culture that are immeasurable? I mean, dare I say that I think there's culture, cultural organisations, and then there's culture. And one of the wonderful things about cultural spaces that they feed, they're viral. And I don't think you can measure those things. And the fact that we work within this structure where we have to demonstrate year on year out these KPIs around numbers and income, it just erases all the richness and diversity of what is so evident about our rich cultural life.
Can I push back just a bit? So I agree with you, but it doesn't mean you can't measure it. We just shouldn't measure it in this stupid static way. So I just wrote this book on the moon landing, and what's interesting about that is, again, it's a classic thing where it was really clear what they were trying to do, get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. But even if they hadn't gotten there, so it's good to be outcomes oriented, but even if they hadn't gotten there, what actually happened along the way, the porousness, all these spillovers across the economy, because to get there, it wasn't just aerospace, it was investing in nutrition, materials, electronics, software, blah, blah, blah. So the kind of Keynesian multiplier effect, and the arts and culture, by the way, have the highest multiplier effect, right? Because it's so labor intensive. For every pound of public subsidy, a lot more happens in the economy than in the automobile industry. I think it's 2 times as high as the automobile industry. So that's like just numbers. But what happens along the way, the catalytic effect, if you're actually working with the community, if you're really bringing in new artists, if you're bringing in new types of audiences, the BBC, which has done that, right? So like PBS in the US is just like, oh, I'm gonna fix the market failure, documentaries and high quality news. The BBC, which has been so ambitious, even doing, high quality talk shows and soap operas, but redefining the soap opera along the way. So EastEnders and not Dallas and Dynasty, just about billionaires. That then created a whole new market. It crowded in business. We have to be able to capture that kind of crowding in, catalytic, multiplicative effect when you reimagine a space. The kind of spillovers along the way to get to the moon, the camera phones, the software, the foil blankets, the diapers, all these things that happen as problems along the way, which is that kind of immeasurable ex ante, because you can't define exactly what has to happen, but ex post, why not? Damn, calculate what happened across the whole economy. And that's just about going beyond cost benefit analysis, beyond net present value, beyond fix the gap and get out of the way. But saying it's immeasurable is
well, no, but I think the economic framework is quite problematic when you come to culture. Because
this wasn't economic, this is about spillovers, about catalyzing activity, collaborations, new conversations.
Yeah, but I don't know, the Moon Project is so different from culture writ large. You know, we're talking about activities that everybody engages with on a daily basis through an institutional framework.
Challenge I'd give to you that though. So I'm an economist, so I worked in many departments, and I used to have to value life.
Well, how did you do it?
Wait, sorry, for what? Like what department? How?
I haven't done this, but this happens in government. They have to for medicine and medical, and we do qualities. They have to measure that. Now, that's not the perfect measure. If you're not measuring it, you're effectively valuing yourself as zero. So this isn't our conference we just did on this. So it all depends on who's asking a question of value.
Yeah.
Right.
That's it.
So who are you trying to prove your value to? Right.
Yeah.
There are some methods where you don't have to go that far. Like I went to an audition doing dance, and I said, you don't need to use the methods I've got, because you're trying to make decisions within your art form, you know it. But if you're going for public funding, you've got to be able to set out what you're trying to value. Now, you may not be able to put that in pound terms, you may not be able to even measure this, but you need to set out what it is. So and many of you have probably seen the Wolf Brown products from 2014 that Arts Council did, and the debate in academia is, the word intrinsic isn't helpful for making your argument.
Yeah.
So you can't measure everything. I'm an economist, I think you can, but we need to be told we're not measuring them.
Right.
Because if you can say what you can measure, and you can say what you can't measure, it's quite important. Because this also goes back to the whole point of what you're talking about groups that are missing. So if you're not measuring it, you're not measuring their value either. So I'll give you a great example of this. Coventry City of Culture does some brilliant work where they went to wards and they actually measured who's engaging in culture, who's not. Very low. This ward has 10% participation. They went to them and asked them, what is your value of culture? They told them and said, well, this is what we define as culture, and that's why they got participation up going through the roof. But to do that then, we have to then show the value of that, show that worth, and we should keep doing more. So it all depends on who you're trying to
No, listen, I don't, in a way, Mariana and I have been talking precisely about doing a long piece of work on this, and I don't think I want to give a knee-jerk reaction. It just does seem to me, it gives me a brain freeze whenever I think about it, because it's so complex. And it is very much about who sets, who determines the value.
But I want to say something really quickly.
Oh yeah.
I think there are many ways that culture is measured. It's like I can't walk in New York and see somebody with a New York fitted and know like they're wearing a New York fitted because Jay-Z wore a New York fitted. I know the price of I was in Soho, very expensive neighborhood in New York. I know Soho because Andy Warhol created a cultural energy around that space, and now a loft space is $8 million. I think there's a lot of ways in which
and who benefits.
Yeah, and I think to your point earlier about how do we then get that back into the system, is that we have to then say, okay, well, maybe something, and this is if your property value went up because you moved into that neighborhood, then there has to be something that in this higher property in terms of keeping the people in the neighborhood. I just don't think, and I said this to my friend Jessica earlier, I don't think anybody who was part of hip hop should ever beg for money. And I mean, like, if you dance on the street, trillions of dollars have been benefited from it.
You're part of that.
You're part of that. And there's no way in which, and I think we have to come up with new systems. One of the things that I think there's a lot of judgment on the older generation in terms of the values that they fought for. And I think they fought for themselves. And I think our generation has to say, okay, let's think of innovative new ideas. because we're in a capitalist society, economically, that'll then reimagine how do those structures work. But I think the values consistently measured. I go to City and Guild, I call Peter Doig, I tell him he's like the Michael Jackson of painting, because the amount of painters who every generation sound like Michael Jackson, the amount of painters who come in and decide that they're a painter, and now they're making a Peter Doig type painting, or they decide I feel a particular way, and they're looking at Tracy Emin or Louis Bourgeois. I mean, those things are super measurable, because you told yourself, I feel this thing, and here you have a kind of guidance structure to let you express that thing.
It's a storytelling thing.
So we have to go upstairs. I'm going to let you two just ask your questions. We're just not going to be able to answer it, but I do feel like we can let you just ask it because you looked urgently wanting to. You want to just ask it?
I think mine's quite controversial because...
Oh, then don't ask it, otherwise we're going to...
I agree with Carmen and what he's saying, because I work for a national network of contemporary art, and we're talking about values all the time and reimagining the public value of the visual arts.
Yeah.
I actually agree that you have to make an economic and social case for the arts to this government
Right. Yeah.
in England,
I would
in
agree.
the UK. And I think that's where we're at. The change might happen in the future, but I'm not so sure actually, because I think all decisions are based on an economic value.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
My name is Richard Noble. I run the art department at Goldsmiths College.
Cool.
And at Goldsmiths College, there's hundreds of people, staff and students who are absolutely committed to the intrinsic value of art. They work together, they disagree with each other, sometimes they hate each other, but they're absolutely committed to making their work and providing an environment where, that's interdisciplinary and exciting and creative. And yet, none of the values that they adhere to and enact in their lives defends them from the funders that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I have to make a case for the employability of students after 15 months.
Yeah.
So the most ambitious students in Britain come to Goldsmiths. They want to be artists, but the government only values them if they get jobs in pharmaceutical companies or in lawyers' offices.
Yeah.
So the public value of art is instrumentalized
Exactly.
in the most grotesque
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
So, if we make lots of money, if we provide employability statistics that show our students are in highly skilled jobs in STEM subjects or STEM activities, then we're judged to be successful.
Yeah.
It's grotesque.
But the irony is that doesn't even, with those metrics that they're putting on, that's actually not what causes economic value. So that the reason the moon landing...
I absolutely agree with you, and I have written a book about going to the moon. I would love to have an economic model that I could use to defend the thing that I work with. But I feel like we're being pushed to an ever narrower conception of utility to justify what we do at the Tate, any kind of cultural institution. And we need more economists to kind of break that apart, because the DCMS and the Ministry of Education are pushing for ever narrower metrics and ever narrower conceptions of what can count as evidence for the value of what we do.
Well, I think partly because students are forced to pay £10,000, £60,000, and they have been conditioned, this generation, to think of it as an investment in their economic future. And I think the previous generation did not have to do that because it wasn't £10,000. It wasn't $50,000. I graduated grad school with $260,000 in debt.
Yeah.
And I wasn't, so I
agree that that's appalling. But
I think that's I don't know if that's a problem or that is a systemic thing, systemic outcome. There's no way you could charge students £30,000 and not expect them to think, how do I pay that back? And there has to be a market
of course.
incentive.
And actually, not that many of them come into art schools worrying about that. You know, their parents, when their kids tell them, okay, I'm the first kid from my family to go to university, and their parents are like amazed. Then they say, I want to go to art school. It's like, shoot me now. But they still go. They still go. And, you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of kids who want to study art.
No, I mean, they do, and they go, but sorry, I know Margot has a point, and we could go forever. Yeah.
I didn't, my point was to just hear Richard's point.
Well, Richard, are you going to stay and have a pizza with us?
Something that's been talked about the links between mental health and national health, about social cohesion, about community creation.
So can I
all
ask?
of those things,
Sorry
there
to-
must be a way of measuring those things, and they in turn have a huge economic value.
Yeah.
And so there's something kind of missing in the joining up.
Well,
I think George wants to come back into.
After the point in the corner, I wanted to ask Mr. DCMS if that's part of the conversation.
So I think two things. There's a mix between economic value and the methods that are used, right? Two different things. Our models do not focus on GDP, right? They focus on all the things we've just been talking about. The issue we have, not issue, the challenge we have is how we measure that, right? So the things you talked about, the things that you said, George, were brilliant, like how does culture change people's behaviour? How does it change how they think? That's all in our model. The question we need to do is a challenge for us is how we put that in our model. So all the things around, when we say intrinsic, what I mean by that is, how do we talk about those things that are intrinsic? How do we break that up and actually define it? And are we capturing that in our model? So our model, back to your point, productivity is a poor measure of societal welfare. Because within that, some of our jobs, we made museums free, suddenly GDP went down.
Yeah.
But our welfare didn't go down. So you have to capture that in your model. So our approach in cultural capital is that very much approach, saying, yeah, measure your GDP, but actually what you're really here for is the cultural value. Let's measure that, and let's put that value on the same terms as economic value. So that's our model. So just not to confuse that, there are two different approaches. We're trying to use cultural value and social value, but using economics, language and techniques to put it on the same basis.
Okay.
Can I just say something very, very quickly? Which is that somebody brought up at the beginning of this the word translation. And when I taught architecture in South Africa, one of the things that was very clear to me was that the majority of black students spoke more than one language. I don't think there's an African alive who doesn't speak more than one language. And there was something intrinsic about the way the students were able to translate between cultures, between languages, between worlds, between paradigms. I think a lot of what we're talking about is the ability to translate between different languages, whether it's the language of science or economics or art. And we're not educating people to be translators. We're educating in really narrow, proficiency-driven tracks. And I think there is something about otherness, which is the ability to live in two worlds at once, which is an incredible force. And we're not valuing it. C'est tout.
Just one thing. So this debate, I think there's a problem with how we in the arts talk about the arts. So we at UCL, sponsored by the Vice Provost Research, did a big report onto the case for the humanities, the arts and humanities. And we made arguments precisely about social cohesion and well-being and health and all these sort of things, and things that possibly one could measure. And these were the arguments we put forward. But then another one, the same people were also saying, the thing that's valuable about the arts precisely is in a world where everything has to be measured, it's immeasurable. It's almost, its value is the fact it resists the whole notion of value, right? And this is the sort of thing you were saying here, doesn't cut any ice with the current government. But I think we have this tension, you know, is it this intrinsic value that your students are so committed to, and we, I think, in the arts are committed to, or do we sort of make a deal with the devil and insist with the guy in the front row that actually we are going to work out ways of measurability?
Just call him the devil.
There's that paradox. Obviously, we did them both. We claimed that the arts were incredibly important because it makes people happier and healthier and so on. I like the idea the arts could be bad for your health, incidentally, you know? But we also tried to say that they're measurable.
So the good news is we're about to embark in hopefully a huge project on this that you're all invited to join between the Tate and IIPP with George and Alvaro. You guys don't know this, but we're going to bring you in. And all these questions are incredibly relevant. So thank you so much also to the online world. you incredibly to the IIPP comms team and Alex Homans, who's the head of events for IIPP, Sylvia, Maddie, Angelo, thank you very much.